So it's always enjoyable to have John Lynch. He's been doing this for, he'll tell us how many years. I think he'll review.
Well, yeah, I think we're getting to 10.
10 years. So today, he's doing either one of two things. He's either giving us an infectious disease talk for the allergist, or he's practicing for tonight's presidential debate. Because we need a good candidate. All right, John.
Thanks very much. That was a good one. I don't know what the word of the, I know what this word is, but this is word of day's new. So do you want to do it? Do you want me to talk about it?
Well, they just needed to get CME credit, so.
Okay. Oh, does anyone know what this word
Tell
is?
us what it means, too.
Multi-drug resistant organ.
There you go. Perfect. Okay, it's quite topical. I have no, this was not me. Someone else put this up. So I've met a lot of people in the room, but not everyone. My name is John Lynch. I'm an infectious disease doctor. I'm on faculty with the EU, and I'm based over at Harborview. I mostly work in what's called infection prevention and control, antimicrobial stewardship, and more recently, sepsis. And I've been doing this talk, as just mentioned, for, I don't know, 9 or 10 years. And it's supposed to be update for the allergist, immunologist, but I basically just do whatever I want to talk about, and it seems to work out okay. And I get feedback every year, you know, and then I don't take it. So here we go. So that's, oh, that is the end of the slideshow. Okay. Hopefully I can go back to the beginning. Well, I say I just have to go here. Yeah, sorry, sir. There we go. Just again, for the new people in the audience, this whole presentation was plagued by AV difficulties for like the first 5 years. Like literally, it didn't start one time on time. So infectious disease update for the allergist, immunologist, that's the title we go by. It's 2020, so I usually give this talk every kind of late winter, early spring. So I just actually gave it in like late winter, early spring. So I told this one 2020 just to keep my file straight. So it's a little early for me to be doing this, but there you go. I have no disclosures. Just again, for the new folks in the audience who we haven't talked before, we've talked, I just go back over the topics. Now this doesn't go back to 2010, which is when I think I first started giving this talk, but I've talked about Zika virus, antibiotic stewardship in the allergist, C. difficile, more Zika, influenza, Ebola, otitis media, a little more C. diff, ecological perspective on ID, Candida auris, more C. diff, and started talking about MDROs in 2018. Then 2019 talked a bit more about ID update, and I hadn't actually finished the MDRO part, so I picked it up. Just again, another caveat, I almost never finish this talk, and I just sort of pick it up the next time. So it's the way it goes. And you guys keep inviting me, so I cannot take any responsibility for this. Okay, and then ID update and where all these organisms and bacteria are coming from, part 2. So I'm going to be going to a different part of the kind of the ecosystem to talk about that. And this is meant to be informal. If you have any questions or comments, if you have expertise in any of these areas, please jump in and feel free to speak up. So ID update. So when I last left you, I think we were talking about the measles investigation, and this was a pretty hot topic. This was an ongoing issue. Since then, things have calmed down quite a bit. So this is measles cases by county. I just looked. The measles outbreak is technically closed in Washington State. I think there was just another new measles outbreak. I don't remember what it was, but I saw in the media just briefly, like yesterday, after I sent these slides in. But you can see that we closed out the last outbreak in, I think, the late spring or summer of this year with 86 cases, with most of those in the Clark County outbreak, really around a specific community there. We had about 12 folks in King County, 2 in Pierce, and 1 in Snohomish. This was obviously a big deal, had a lot of ramifications in many different ways, right? And it continues to be having ramifications around the states as a result of multiple outbreaks occurring at the same time. The key thing to do with the measles part of this outbreak is the problem of under-vaccination. So the Clark County one was really in a group of our community of individuals who are under-vaccinated in the pediatric population. Measles has one of the most infectious viruses we know about. It basically infects about 90+% of everyone who's not immune, so not vaccinated or has no history of measles if exposed. So when you think about herd immunity in a measles vaccinated population, you're talking about like 98%. people need to be vaccinated to prevent new cases from emerging. So vaccination plays a critical role in measles prevention. So once this started rolling, and it was this big outbreak sort of got people focused on this problem, there were some reactions, and this is true across the country, but I wanted to point out what happened here in Washington State. So this is HB 1638, so House Bill 1638. That was passed, I think, in May of this year, and basically you can read what it says, but the Washington State Legislature passed a bill that removes the personal and philosophical option to exempt children from MMR. So up until this point in Washington State, you could just say, I have a personal objection to, or my child has a personal objection to getting a measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and could still go to school. This is in addition to religious objections. So this took place, so this actually got enacted and then went into effect in July. And this applies to all public and private schools and childcare. So you can't just say, I object, right? You have to actually have, the only way to get out of it is a medical exemption or a religious exemption. And you can also see there, it also requires employees and volunteers at child care centers to provide immunization records indicating they have received the MMR vaccine or proof of immunity. People don't, I don't know if everyone recalls, but one of the things that doesn't address is one of the big problems in the Issaquah High School outbreak or exposure was that they had to shut down Issaquah High School because not enough of the teachers were immune. Wow. And so they didn't have enough teachers to keep it open and safe. And so I'm not sure if there's language in here specifically around teachers in public schools and what their requirements are. But this is a big deal, right? There's been many people very active in pushing immunization law in Washington State for many years. And this was centimeters away from not getting passed because of a rider that got thrown onto it that was going to really kind of counteract the effect of it. So it came down to like a very close win on the part of a lot of people working very hard to get this passed. As I mentioned, this is a thing that's been going on nationwide. This is a map from the National Conference of State Legislators, looking at the states with religious exemptions, the darker blue, and personal belief exemptions in the hash thing there. And you can see there are states that don't have either. This is updated in 2019. So you can see there's still a handful of states, including Washington State, that allow the personal exemption. That allow the religious exemption. And I think hopefully you guys can see this. This is looking at, from the Pew Research Center, looking at the states that allow religious exemptions, personal exemptions, and religious exemptions, personal exemptions that do not mention religion, and then no non-medical exemptions. So there's a few handful of states on the East Coast that allow really nothing in terms of exemptions aside from medical stuff.
It's interesting, New York had the biggest outbreak, and yet it's offering no exemptions. How did that occur?
Well, I think this is in part a result of that.
Oh, okay.
So they don't allow anything. Doesn't matter whether you have any religious exemptions or personal. You get vaccinated or you don't go to school.
So this is subsequent to that big outbreak?
I think that they did move forward on the legislation as a result of that outbreak, yes. So I just wanted to bring up a sort of an interesting thing here. So this is, I'm not going through all of this right here, but I wanted to include it for your reading later. This is from a paper published in 2014, Personal Belief Exemptions from School Vaccination Requirements. And just the highlight I wanted to make here was that when you put in legislation like this, one of the things that happens is that religious exemptions go up dramatically. And people have looked at this. There are actually no religions that people can actually find that ban vaccination, like in the books, right? All religions tend to have rule books, right? I think that's what religions are. And there's no one says that you shouldn't get vaccinated. Yet people can still claim it as part of their religious practice. So when you look at some of these data that's been out there, and again, this goes back a little bit, that if you look at someone, here's the quote, being reared as an adherent to religion which are opposed to immunization, the religious exemption rate, this is after making that change, increased from 2.4% to 5.8%. So basically doubled after following a legislative maneuver to make only religious exemptions being possible. And then similarly, if you do the same thing, this is looking at the number of exemptions after a similar change increased by a factor of 2.5-fold, despite a drop in the absolute number of medical exemptions over that time. So it's really interesting. We're starting to see, I think, a trickle of this in Washington State, that when you kind of this squeezing the balloon effect for this population of people who sort of irrationally decide vaccinations aren't good for them, that they just go from one indication to another indication to get the same effect. So just sort of interesting. We're going to see how that plays out, but just the social ramifications of sort of infectious disease prevention is, I think, fascinating. Okay, just a quick update on Ebola. I always like to talk about this, just to let people know where we are. This is, I think, a pretty hot topic in much of the world around infectious diseases. We have not seen any cases. Yeah, go ahead.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
What about the MTHFR medical exemption that the naturopaths are now pushing for measles?
So I'm not an expert in this. You guys know way more about this than I do. My understanding is there's zero data, none, showing that there's any contraindication to getting vaccinated with anything with that mutation.
That's what I thought too. I just wanted to.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's zero. Does anyone else know? That's my understanding. There's nothing to show that there's any. There's a couple of these mutations that that community is pushing as medical exemptions. Yeah.
I wonder.
And I think they're using it for other things too. Yeah.
Yeah, everything that they don't want to have.
Yeah. 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 This is a good question.
I don't know if everybody in the room knows
Yeah.
what that is. I'm not aware. Want to explain it?
Well, it's methylating. It's a gene that's present in a lot of people. It's supposed to affect metabolism of different medications. And the naturopaths have figured out that they have pretty much of a gold mine, and anybody wants a medical exemption if they have this positive gene mutation, they'll sign a waiver that says they can't get vaccinated because their risk is too high.
No, it's just unproven assertion.
It's like all the other stuff about measles.
Yeah, I think it's a polymorphism. How much of an impact? Everyone has, CYP gene polymorphisms. We all metabolize drugs differently. Hopefully, somebody in the future will understand all that better and how we use medications in individuals. But that is not a contraindication to getting vaccinated. Right? It doesn't play a role.
Unless you're a naturopath that wants to sell it.
Right. And so, just as an aside, just because that community tends to go that way, when we at our hospital you have to get vaccinated as your healthcare worker or be compliant with the program, and if you have a medical exemption, it has to be signed by an MD, DO, ARNP, or PA. We won't accept it from naturopaths. On the other hand, I run this very large telementoring program for Stewardship. We just had a naturopath come on and talk about who's actually one of the Washington State champions for vaccination. He's actually been targeted, held up as a champion, and he is a fantastic advocate for vaccination. So I don't want to tar the whole group, but there are fantastic pro-vaccine people in the naturopath community. But in general, this just makes no sense. There's no data whatsoever. Okay, so Ebola. Just as again, this is I say January 27, 2019. So. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, this is when I left you. Okay, yeah, this is what I showed you guys last time. So in January, it was 733 cases with about 459 deaths. So just over half the people who were getting infected. And this is in the North Kivu, sort of the eastern side of DRC. So this is the numbers as of when I turned in these slides last week. So again, 733 infections, 500 deaths, 3,210 infections. So I showed you this in January. This is the new one with 2,100 deaths, so looking at 2/3 of the folks are dying, with about 1,000 survivors. I'll just put it as an aside. The surviving with Ebola is not, it's great to survive it, but we're learning that it has enormous ramifications, and for reasons that are very much not clear. Probably a lot of these are immune mediated. Some of them have to do with persistent viral infections in the eye and other immune tolerant organs. So surviving this is not a walk in the park either. But you can see just a huge outbreak that's continuing to be ongoing. This is the epi curve. So even though we've seen a huge increase in cases, that was really these cases here. It does appear to be going down quite a bit. And again, I pointed out the map, I think, last year. This is the area where it's really focused. So it's right in the border of Uganda. There was 1 or 2 cases in Uganda. I'll also point out that it also shares a border down here with Tanzania, and there is a case of hemorrhagic fever. It was actually one of, I work for ITEC, for Infection Control Project in Kenya, and one of our workers was diagnosed with hemorrhagic fever. No one knows what it was. And a bunch of exposed people were moved out to the border. So we're still waiting to hear about whether there's any evidence of exposure in that area. Uganda, I guess, had a case, but really this is focused in this far eastern area. There's a lot going on in this area, which I'll briefly touch on as we go through this. I did want to, I think people saw this in the media. This just came out in August. We've had a couple different things. We've had a vaccine and a drug treatment for Ebola that have been in use for the past couple of years, really since this outbreak occurred. But just recently, 2 new treatments. So one's called REGN or Regen EB3, and the other one's called MAB or monoclonal antibody 114. And these just kind of finished their initial trials and were basically being shown to be much more effective than anything we have so far. And as a result, have been kind of through immediate emergency release being made to, available to all people in this affected area. So this is just some of the brief data. Best one I could find is from the Cambodian media, Phnom Penh Post, with this really nice graphic here, looking at the 2 clinical trials. So here's the REGN, which is a cocktail, I think, of 3 monoclonal antibodies and monoclonal antibody 114. This is looking at the mortality rate in the treated people. This is looking at ZMapp and remdesivir. So ZMapp is a monoclonal and remdesivir is an antiviral, and then compared to no treatment. So in these areas like the DRC, we're seeing 2/3 of people dying. That brought it down, maybe 10 or 15%. But these 2 new monoclonals brought it down significantly more. So probably, a 50% improvement in treatment for people with Ebola. So again, these 2 drugs have been sort of put off to the side, and the real focus now is on getting anybody with Ebola to this, because you can see that's an enormous change compared to baseline here. So that's very good, very exciting. And it's amazing what can be done in terms of drug trials in the place this challenging.
What do these monoclonals target on the virus?
I was going to include a picture, but I didn't. I don't remember, actually. A lot of stuff. So the REGN EB3 is it's like 3 different areas of the virus, and the MAB 114 it only targets 1 spot. I don't recall off the top of my head.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
One of the things I wanted to point out, though, in that area of the DRC is why that epicurve is so bad. And why you see fluctuations in it. And I mean, granted, it looks like it's getting better, but one of the major issues that's been going on there is that I think anybody familiar with the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo recognizes, particularly in the eastern and northern part, there's a lot of conflict going on. And so this is looking at 2018 and 2019 out to May from a nice New England Journal paper published earlier this summer, looking at just a number of incidents of armed conflict, civil unrest, community resistance, crime, and hazards. And I'll just point out that there's a couple of things here to pay attention to. One is the blue bar, armed conflict, going up and up and up and sort of hitting a plateau over sort of the spring of this year. But then also this purple line of community resistance going up and up and up. And so the issue here is that when you have community resistance, people aren't going to go to the Ebola treatment centers. They're not going to, come in and get treated. They're going to isolate family members who are ill. They're going to handle burials on their own. And so you're going to have huge barriers to actually getting these drugs or getting isolation to people. I'll also point out, because of this armed conflict, CDC is actually not there. So a lot of the sort of emergency workers in the global level aren't in some of the hot spots. So the CDC, I think, hasn't been there since like a year ago in some parts of that area, some of the hardest hit areas, because of the threat of violence. So some of these armed conflicts are targeting healthcare settings, including Ebola treatment centers. And so you have this combination of, it's a very dangerous disease. Unfortunately now, or fortunately now, with some treatment that's being made available, but you have both people resisting treatment for a variety of reasons, and you also have armed conflict going on, where the healthcare workers and emergency workers themselves are being targeted. And so if you're, worried about getting treated or getting your family member isolated, never seeing them again, and or you're worried about that place that you're going to go to getting attacked, right? That's going to get in the way. Fortunately, you can see there's a big decrease in May in the same area, but this has been, again, the CDC has not been back to some of these areas as a result. Yes?
This may be a naive question, but looking at the success of treatment,
Yeah.
Is this virus different than, say, something like influenza? Does it not change? Or can you learn something from this that would help with a disease like influenza to make a more effective vaccine?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think that we don't use monoclonals for influenza right now. So, mostly with influenza, we're fine. So, putting something as expensive as currently monoclonals are still fairly expensive, putting that into people who aren't going to have a mortality rate that looks like that is going to be a challenge. Monoclonals probably would work for influenza. One of the other issues is that influenza A particularly, once the outbreak occurs, we're just dealing with sort of the variant that's in there, but that it changes significantly from year to year, right? We know this with the challenges of the vaccine. There's enough genetic drift every year that we often miss the boat. And there's some signals right now from Helen Chu, who does flu work here in Seattle and basically swabs like everyone in the city, that what she's seeing, because we've seen about a half dozen influenza A cases at Harborview, 6 more or so at Northwest, another half dozen at the VA, and so forth. So it's out there, is that it doesn't look like it's a great match right now. And so we have a lot to go on that. And then lastly, when we do see genetic shifts in influenza A, if you're targeting hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, then you might miss 1 or 2 of those antigens. I did talk about, on a prior one, I did talk about the plan to get to a universal flu vaccine. And I think that work is still moving in very much the positive direction. I'm hoping, maybe 5 years or so, we'd be looking at something like that. And that's where we really want to focus efforts, as opposed to treatment. Okay, this is just looking at, again, just illustrates sort of the social phenomena of armed conflict and community resistance and the actual impact it has on disease in Ebola. This is looking at the curves of number of cases over time. And you can see here, this is a massacre in Benin. And you can see this increase in cases immediately following. There's an electoral crisis following overall. You can see that happened again. This is where folks burned Ebola treatment centers in Katwa and Butembo, and you can see an enormous spike following that. So this is a human-created crisis, right? It's a disease that attacks people who are impoverished, and it preys on civil unrest and violence. It's just fascinating. We spend a lot of time talking about vaccines and treatments, and those are extremely important. But this is a problem that's preying on basically a human ecology and human social constructs. Okay, a little update there. Again, I'm trying to give you a little twist on how I see some of these outbreaks between measles and the vaccine and the response in Ebola and civil unrest and so forth. Last one I want to talk about in terms of outbreaks is hepatitis A. So just so everyone's clear, there's a hepatitis A outbreak going on across the United States right now. It is a big, big problem. It started a number of years ago in San Diego, probably linked actually to I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, I think it was a Major League Baseball, like all-star game in San Diego. So they decided to clean out San Diego. Anybody familiar with San Diego? The park is like right near that tourist area, right? So there used to be a lot of homeless folks living in that area. So they decided to clean it all out, move all the homeless folks out for this big National League Baseball, whatever thing is, and all-star game. And they kind of flushed everyone out to a place where there was no access to hygiene, right? No bathrooms, no homeless areas to stay in. And as a result, people didn't have access to water and soap or bathrooms. And so there was a huge influenza A outbreak associated with a number of deaths in San Diego. And that was, again, going back, I think, like 4 years now. Since then, we've had outbreaks occurring around the country, mostly in homeless individuals, but in other risk groups. So you can see this again, just looked at this. So since this big outbreak started in 2016, 30 states have publicly reported hepatitis A outbreaks, and we have them going on right now. And since then, we've had almost 30,000 cases of hepatitis A in the United States. I'll point out 60% of them have been hospitalized. Now that's a detection bias, right? We're going to detect more people who are sicker. But that's consistent with the San Diego outbreak, where they did a lot of active surveillance and going and testing people and putting a lot of message out. About 60% of their folks in San Diego also required hospitalization. So Hep A is not just like, I feel terrible, I have the flu. It puts people in the hospital. So it's a bad disease. And you can see a handful of deaths, about 274 deaths so far. So quite meaningful. When we think about the risk groups, I think right now we're thinking mostly about homeless individuals, people who don't have access to hygiene. Again, another socially constructed epidemic, as most of them are. But it's also folks who are using drugs, often to do with an overlap with homelessness, people, as I mentioned, who have unstable housing. There is a risk group of men who have sex with men, and that's played out a little bit in Washington State, particularly in the Spokane outbreak. People who are incarcerated, and then obviously we worry about people with chronic liver disease, because if you have cirrhosis, Hep B or Hep C, and you get Hep A on top of it, it can be devastating. So just to give you a map, the state reported hepatitis A outbreaks as of October 4th, 2019. You can see that the darker the color, the more cases. See, this has really hit the sort of, I guess, Mississippi River Valley area, the southeastern United States. And, said Tennessee and that whole area out here in Kentucky, down to Florida. We've had, cases out here in, Nevada and Arizona and Washington State's in some of these lighter colors, but you can see that's still a fair number of cases. So this is really a nationwide problem, and pretty much any place that has an urban area with a homeless issue is seeing hepatitis A outbreak right now. And I worry about this not only for the patients who are affected, but hepatitis A it just lives in the environment. If you have people who don't have access to hygiene, don't have access to go to the bathroom, these viruses can bubble over into, playgrounds and dog parks and all these other places and cause problems for everyone. So this is a count for Washington State. Again, just as of, I think, last week, we declared a statewide outbreak in July of 2019. We have, as so far, 75 cases with, again, quite a number of them requiring hospitalization. Fortunately, none of them have died, which is fantastic. And in King County itself, we've seen 26 cases. So it's not just King County. We've actually had a very large outbreak. The biggest outbreak has been in Spokane. And it's been a mixed outbreak, initially among a population of men who have sex with men, and then subsequently in folks who are using drugs. It's interesting, it's not just intravenous drugs, it's also oral opioid dependence as well. So, and again, there might be an overlap there with unstable housing or just, how people conduct their lives and getting exposed. It's kind of different to get the, the outbreak cases from total cases. We have had a handful of cases where I have no idea. They don't say they're in any risk group. They're not homeless, can't figure out where it's coming from. It's not a restaurant, it just occurs. And it's not clear why that's happening. But this is something that's really the Department of Health and here in Seattle, the Public Health Seattle King County has really spent a lot of time on in pushing vaccination in our homeless population. My plug here is that if you're seeing someone who's homeless or in stable housing or in any of those risk groups, it's actually, we need to be asking them if they're vaccinated or looking to see if they're vaccinated and to vaccinate them. So our ED is starting a vaccination program. So historically, EDs don't like to vaccinate anyone, right? They don't want to be in the primary care business. A couple years ago, our ED started doing influenza vaccination for homeless people because of the outbreak. Historically, we've seen influenza outbreaks in the homeless about a month ahead of everyone else. So obviously an at-risk population, so we're trying to vaccinate them early. But they've also started doing hepatitis A vaccination this year if you're homeless. So the thing there is that a lot of folks have barriers to care. They're not going to, tell you that they need a hepatitis A vaccine, and so it's really upon our entire system to capture folks wherever they are and vaccinate them, if at all possible. Now, the thing I'll also point out is that there's really kind of two major preparations for hepatitis A vaccine. There's hepatitis A/B, right? So there's a combo vaccine that requires 3 shots, and that's great. It covers A and B. The problem is for a lot of folks who are in these risk groups, they don't access care enough to get the 3 shots. So the hepatitis A the monovalent one, if you give 1 shot of the straight up Hep A, it's about 96% effective. Now it is a 2-dose series, but if you get 1 into them, then they're going to be essentially protected. So folks who don't access care have a lot of barriers to care. If you can get 1, this is what we're doing in our ED, if you can get 1 of those monovalent Hep A vaccines to them, it's going to make a big impact on protecting them. Again, you're missing Hep B, so if they have that risk factor, try to get that done. But Hep A is really the biggest risk right now. We don't see much Hep B, so we really focus on Hep A. Any questions about these outbreaks?
With the success in Hep C treatment, do those antiviral agents work for Hep A and Hep B at all, or is it no?
No, they're targeted at Hep C. They're basically like an HIV drug for Hep C, right? They're targeting the Hep C specific enzymes, protease and stuff like that. So they're really.
So vaccination is the only option we have at this point.
Vaccination is, yeah, it's the reaction to the fact that we have homeless people, right? And we're not giving them places to go to the bathroom or wash their hands. Yeah. So the only reaction is vaccination. The only action is to get these people into safe places. Anything else? Any questions? Okay. Like I told you, for the new folks, I get to talk whatever I want, so. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So the word of the day was MDROs, and I've talked about this in the past, and I'm going to just talk about a couple of things. One is a sort of a personal experience and give you a kind of a global example, and then I'm going to shift into sort of different population that we haven't talked about, but you guys appear to want to hear about. So again, for the new folks, I think I've shown this slide before. This is an estimate that comes out of a group in the UK looking at the potential impact of drug-resistant organisms on patients across the planet. If we don't do something to slow the emergence of drug-resistant bacteria, bacterial infections, we're looking at an additional 10 million deaths per year by 2050. Additional, on top of the deaths that are already occurring. And obviously the costs of that are going to be enormous. So 10 million deaths per year in addition to what we're already seeing. So we don't have much time to deal with this, and definitely is a big, big problem. So I do work. I mentioned I do infection control at Harborview. I also have a telementoring program across the Pacific Northwest, and I also work in Kenya on working with the Ministry of Health there on a CDC project to do implementation of infection prevention and antibiotic stewardship programs in 2 municipal or city hospitals. And this is, as I was there recently, I did a visiting sort of talk at a hospital called Aga Khan University Medical Center. So this is not one of the centers that I'm doing our project in, but one of our faculty is actually the chief of medicine here, Michael Cheng. And so I just wanted to show you, give an example. So this is a top flight hospital in Nairobi, right? They're doing caths, they do, fantastic medical care. All kinds of surgeries, neurosurgery, fantastic facilities, part of the larger global Aga Khan sort of universe of hospitals and healthcare. Really a pretty tremendous place. But if you go here and get in their ICU, you're going to, or if you show up in acute care and look like you have an infectious disease, you're going to get vancomycin and you're going to get meropenem. And that's because if you look at their antibiogram, this is an example. So Klebsiella, so they don't see GPCs, gram-positives, like we do. Like they don't, MRSA is not the first thing that causes big problems. What they see there are gram-negative rods in the blood and other places. And this is looking at their #1 blood isolate, so Klebsiella pneumoniae. So I'll take all their blood isolates. This is the biggest one, most common. And this is the susceptibility profile. So this is looking at percent susceptible. So basically, everything except meropenem, 84%, so that means 16% of them coming through the door are meropenem or carbapenem resistant. And that leaves, amikacin, which is not a very good drug. So this is what the susceptibility profile looks like for someone rolling through the door with a community-acquired gram-negative infection at Aga Khan University. Pretty frightening. And again, the rest of these, it's all a flip of the coin at best, whether the drug you're going to give them does work. And you're going to miss it, 15% of the time. So here's the #1 urine isolate. So amikacin a little bit better, meropenem a little bit better, but the rest at best 2/3 susceptible. So this is what we're looking at when I talk about that global, 10 million people infections per year. This is what we're looking at, is this everywhere. And this, just like I talked about Ebola preying on impoverished areas, this is what's happening in the rest of the world. If you go to India, you go to Bangladesh, you go to Afghanistan, you go to Kenya, you go to parts of South America, you go to China, this is what you see, are these gram-negative rods in neonatal ICUs, in pneumonia, in VAP, in surgical site infections, in urinary tract infections. And when everyone's getting meropenem, it's just a matter of time before that lower number just is going to creep lower and lower and lower and lower. And we're going to be left with drugs like amikacin and colistin, which are older drugs and incredibly toxic and actually not that good. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of point that out. This is what's going on right now and why that MDRO word of the day was so worthwhile. So again, I brought this up before. This is because of this issue, and we've actually seen this in parts of the United States, New York, New Jersey, sometimes in LA, particularly in our skilled nursing facilities and long-term acute care facilities. We're seeing this sort of creep upward. The United States published a report, the Antibiotic Resistance Threats in 2013 from the CDC. They listed a whole bunch of stuff on here, including carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, drug-resistant gonorrhea, and then a whole bunch of other serious threats in terms of drug resistance. There was a national strategy that was published a few years back that I think is starting to actually have some impact in terms of activities and funding. At the global level, the UN had a high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance, only the 4th high-level meeting it's ever had in its existence, and it was really focused on antibiotic resistance. And fortunately, they've continued to pay attention. All this sort of work and discussion led to what's called the Global Health Security Agenda. I'm not going to go spend much time on this, but the basic issue here is that if drug resistance is a security threat, right? It's the threat to destabilizing how we provide healthcare. If you can't treat people coming through your door, if you can't prophylax people getting surgeries, if you can't do cancer therapy safely by preventing infections, right? That's a major issue, and the potential for destabilizing your economy is a big deal. The costs of these are just enormous, right? If you're a middle-income country, or a low-middle-income like Kenya, or a middle-income country like Thailand, right, and you're spending billions and tens of billions of dollars on your healthcare system that's all a result of drug resistance, that's a serious problem as well. So what the Global Health Security Agenda is really this consortium of many countries and organizations looking at funding, work around how to slow down drug resistance, how to do surveillance, so improve laboratory capacity, globally, how to do things like infection control, and a number of other, like how to track vaccinations, how to give vaccinations in order to prevent infections. I'll point out that one of the biggest issues we face globally is that many labs, or the capacity of labs to detect these drug-resistant organisms, is extremely poor. So in the 2 hospitals I work in, Thika and Kitale in Kenya, the docs don't send specimens because they're not going to get results back. They have laboratory expertise, but they don't have the reagents to run their lab regularly all the time. They may have these automated systems, they have all that sort of stuff, but they don't have enough stuff consistently to actually get results back out. And so we know there's horrible drug resistance there, but we actually don't know how much, and that's true for much of the planet. We just don't actually have a sense of how bad the problem really is.
When you look at medical tourism for like joint replacements in India and Thailand, they don't have these kind of numbers. How do they avoid that?
So the people who get the joint replacements don't come back with these infections.
Right.
So I think 2 things. One, places like India have the whole spectrum of medical care, right? So you can actually, the medical tourism in India is like a line item on the national budget, right? That's a big deal for them. They get a lot of money into their system because of medical tourism. They have very high level medical care that's accessible in India. This is true in other countries too. And so I think there's places in India you can go where that's a very, very, very high priority, and there's many efforts and lots of money put into preventing that from happening. I will point out when the NDM1 was first described, so the New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase in 2009 was described, that researcher was banned from coming to India ever again. He was a UK researcher, Tim Walsh. It was Tim Walsh, and because, well, one, he published this big report that this incredibly drug-resistant, gene, this carbapenem resistance mechanism was all over the place in Indian hospitals. Subsequent research was found in the water in the streets in metropolitan India, so it was banned. So it's also that last time we started naming these types of things after places, right? So it's not really good practice anymore to name things like after New Delhi or Middle East respiratory syndrome. It's kind of frowned upon because it carries a lot with it, and it tends to be targeting these poorer parts of the world when you name things. So it was very, very sensitive topic, and so since then, India has done a lot of work around this, but the problem is that access to antibiotics doesn't require a prescription in many parts of the world, including many parts of India. And if you choose to flip that, you're actually disrupting, a lot of people's livelihoods, like, pharmacists' lives. That's how they make a living, is selling medications. And so it's a complicated issue. They've done a lot of work on it. I think that there are facilities in India that they pay very much attention to, but there's underneath that top 1% or 0.1%, there's a lot that don't have access to that or don't have the ability to deal with it. Second thing, though, I'll say is that at my facility, if you've been in a hospital in the prior 12 months and get transferred outside the United States and get transferred to Harborview, we put you in contact precautions immediately. And we surveil you for VRE, MRSA, carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter, carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, and Candida auris. And until those are all negative, we don't let you out of contact precautions. Because almost everyone who gets transferred to my facility who's been in a hospital in the prior year has a drug-resistant organism, either causing infection or colonizing them. So it happens all the time. And we've seen a handful. The UW reported a pan-resistant Bacteroides, which is like unheard of, a gut bug, from a guy who had like an ERCP in India a number of years back. The first NDM case we had got injured in India and was transported to Harborview. So we see it all the time. The second NDM case was a guy who got hit by a bus in Tibet or Nepal and came in. So big problem. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's sober.
Yeah, exactly. That's my job, to make everyone happy and excited. So, okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Well, I'm going to continue on this, but sort of take a hard left here in a minute. So, why is this happening? And I brought this up before. I showed you this graphic. So, the estimate is out there is that, you can bat around an exact number, but people estimate that about half of antibiotic use is inappropriate. It's actually in some settings, it's probably a lot more. Outpatient settings, it's probably a lot more. Inpatient settings, probably closer to 50%. And we think when we use antibiotics inappropriately, we drive C. diff, we drive adverse events, we drive increased costs, we drive drug resistance. But the key thing here, and I think everyone recognizes this, but it's good to just be clear, is that all antibiotic use drives C. diff, drives adverse events, drives drug resistance, and drives increased costs. So, even when we use antibiotics appropriately, we create all these problems. So antibiotics are amazing, they're life-saving, right? They're critical, but they are problematic for many reasons. And so when we think about how to deal with this problem, what we're really looking is how do we slow it down? We're not going to stop drug resistance from emerging, just like we're not going to stop adverse events from occurring with medication treatment or the costs associated with them. So the idea is how to slow it down. And this is where I sort of take a left turn. Again, I've shown you this before, but when we use antibiotics, I think everyone recognizes, but it's always interesting when I tell this to patients that we give people antibiotics, it doesn't go just to the infection, right? It's all the bugs in our body, both good and bad. And drug resistance is part of the planet, right? When we give lots of antibiotics at the level we're giving them in humanity, what we're doing is selecting for pre-existing mutants. And again, this is more for the new folks, just because I think it's cool. Right, because there's some of you I've never talked to, right? Yes. So you guys don't want to acknowledge it. Is that this is a cool study going back into those like the ice plugs they do. This is a tundra plug, and they so this is a study that was done a number of years ago, published I think in Nature, and they went up to the Yukon where there's permafrost, or at least there used to be permafrost, and they did a plug. So they put a steel plate down, they alcohol it off, they do this plug, and then they pull it up. And they can do all kinds of cool, like climate stuff and other stuff. But they were able to go back, date these layers in there. And this is going back, that little arrow is back to about 30,000 years ago, back when there were, the giant ducks and elephant horses and things like that. And from that sample, they were able to isolate a couple of genes, VAN-A and VAN-B. VAN-A and VAN-B are the genes that make vancomycin-resistant enterococcus vancomycin-resistant. And I know that no one was using vancomycin at this time. So we weren't doing it, right? Just 30,000 years ago in the tundra. The issue here is that all the drugs we use are essentially derived, not all of them, 100%, but most of the drugs we use are derived in some way, shape, or form from naturally occurring substances that come out of fungi and yeast, fungi and bacteria. They've been fighting each other for billions of years. So most of drug resistance, it definitely occurs as a result of some mutation, but a lot of it's already there. And so when we use all these drugs, we're just simply selecting for it. And we use drugs in a lot of places. I put this link here for you to take a look at, just to give you I won't do it now unless we have time at the end, because it's really cool, looking at the evolution of bacteria. And it gives you just a picture that bacteria are very good at becoming resistant, very, very fast. And so whenever we use drugs, it's going to happen. And we use drugs a lot. we use drugs even when we don't need them. So we know there's very, very good data, randomized control, multiple trials showing that antibiotic utilization for respiratory tract infections is not useful. This is a placebo-controlled study showing that it's all exactly the same. Outcomes are exactly the same whether you use antibiotics or not. Yet getting this information into frontline providers is very tricky. And we know that URIs and lower respiratory tract infections are one of the major reasons we use antibiotics. So despite very good data out there, so we don't need to be using these drugs, we use a lot of them inappropriately, and they cost a lot. This is a study, or not a study, but this is from the Washington Health Alliance, which is a group of companies in Washington State that looked at antibiotic utilization and basically looked at, this is folks who got antibiotics for rhinosinusitis or acute external otitis. So this is folks who, per guidelines, shouldn't be getting antibiotics. And they basically did analysis of all of the prescriptions, and their analysis showed that 98% of folks who had this diagnosis got antibiotics inappropriately. So big cost. And even if we say they're even wrong by half, right? 50%, say it's not 98% of it's wasted, it's 50% of it's wasted. It's a huge amount of inappropriate antibiotic use. We're also increasing the technology out there. So this is endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography scope, ERCP. You guys may have remembered the Virginia Mason outbreak a few years back. We're basically learning that you cannot sterilize these, you cannot clean them permanently, right? They all carry bacteria, sometimes, most of the time not bad bacteria, but sometimes bad bacteria. They're too complicated. And this is just an example of many technologies used in medicine where you cannot, you're not going to use a sterile instrument, but you also, this is life-saving, right? This is really important. We also travel. So you just asked about, hips and knees and medical tourism. This is a big deal. It's only going to be growing. So we move drug-resistant bacteria across the planet. They move it across. So up here, this is a Klebsiella pneumonia carbapenemase, which we transferred to Israel, Japan, and India. This is the NDM1, which, since then has gone to 50 plus countries. So these things move back and forth very quickly. And as a result, we're developing reservoirs across the planet for drug-resistant bacteria. So this is looking at humans and food processing animals. So this is where I take a left turn, because I haven't talked about this before, and and I thought you might be interested. So when we think about bacteria that live in places like hospitals, like Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, there's some that are pretty isolated to very specific populations, but many of the bacteria that cause diseases in humans move between communities, hospitals, and animals, particularly agriculture animals, the animals that we eat and get milk from. So, we don't want to do this, right? So this is a problem, but we love our animals, both as pets, but also we are very much intertwined with our agricultural life. So many of us eat meat or drink milk or eat cheese or whatever, and those all come, for the most part, in the United States from industrialized settings or CAFOs. And so the human-animal interface is really a big deal. And the issue here is that antibiotics have been used in animals for a very long time. So basically since, antibiotics have been out, we've been using antibiotics in them. And this was very much clearly recognized that antibiotic use in animals was going to lead to drug resistance. There's some very good books on this topic. But this is just an example of an older advertisement. Keep them out. CRD, air sac, sinusitis, nonspecific enteritis, blue comb, all these diseases in chickens. Continuous, high-level feeding of aureomycin. This was the practice, and has been the practice in the United States and many other parts of the world for decades and decades and decades. We recognize that antibacterials do two things in animals. One, they allow us to congregate animals very tightly together and feed them things that are not normal, right? Cows are not supposed to eat corn. When cows eat corn, they get diarrhea. And then they get diarrhea, and then that's diarrhea everywhere, and they get ulcers, and they get skin breakdown, and in addition, they're very stressed because they're very close together. They get sick super easily. So the only way to keep them alive is to give them lots of antibiotics when they get remotely sick. The other thing is if you give them low-level antibiotics all the time, they get bigger, fatter, faster, right? So this is growth enhancement. So just think about all of us learned in biology that if you give, a bunch of organisms a low-level exposure, you're basically selecting out bacterial mutants, right? Very easy. Right. And so this is what we've been doing in agriculture since antibiotics are available. And as I said, we live side by side, right? So this is just a graphic you can certainly take a look at. is that when you give animals antibiotics, right, they generate a lot of drug resistance, and that drug resistance gets out into the water, gets into the dirt, it gets into the farm workers. It can blow up, manure, it can blow down wind and infect surrounding communities. It can land on the cornfield that's adjacent, right? It gets out and about into all of these areas and eventually gets obviously directly into humans by being a farm worker or maybe in the community next door or into that farm worker's families. And some of the history here is that this is the way we used to do farming, right? Cows or cows, these are pigs. Sorry. Maybe that one's a cow, but sorry, these are pigs. And I have chickens. I have 3 chickens in my backyard. They're very happy. He's got a yuppie chickens, right? They all get organic food. They're very, pleasant. My kids hug them and squeeze them and all that stuff. And so, and that's, this is how we got meat for a long time when we had access to meat. These are all pretty happy little piggies. But we've been stepping that up. So we now do industrialized agriculture. All the animals, they are inside. They're, cheek by jowl. The way they're bred. The litters are pulled apart. I mean, it's industrialization, right? And this is how we maintain inexpensive protein in our diets. And farm workers are living in these, among these animals, right? This is actually a pretty nice looking facility. I'd say there's lots of facilities out there, if not most of the industrial ones are not nearly like this. So when you think about the way you look at that pretty little pig in the backyard versus what we're seeing in that second 2 pictures, if you look at the total number of swine operations, this is only going to 2009, back to 1965. So back in 65, we had over 1 million different swine operations. In the United States, and you can see down to a far lower number. And then you can see the average number of pigs per operation has gone up astronomically, right? So you used to have, 25 pigs or 50 pigs, and now you have 1,000 pigs per operation. So this is just an example that just shows you graphically how we've industrialized animal production in the United States. Here's looking at pig meat production in developed countries is this sort of orange one. You can see it's sort of not quite a plateau, but a slow rise. And in developing countries, it's risen a great deal. Oops. And the issue here is that the rest of the world wants protein like we have been having protein, right? Access to protein. They want inexpensive pigs or pork, chicken, and beef like we want it because perceptions around health and all kinds of things. And so this is what we're seeing globally. And at the same time, in those countries, they're intensifying. The only way to do that is to do the same thing we've done, is to industrialize agriculture. And part of that industrialization is antibiotic use, both to treat diseases that are occurring in the animals, but also to enhance growth. And just to give you an example of this globally, this again is 2011, this looks at the global chicken population in times 1,000. So this is back in 61, 5 million plus 3 more zeros. So was that 5 billion? And we're now at, well over, probably approaching 25 billion. So, a quintupling, if not a sextupling of the chicken population in the world, right? It's a big number. And these are increasingly going into these concentrated settings where antibiotics are being used and diseases get transmitted as well. I don't know if any of you grew up in farm. I'm just being clear. I'm not disparaging anyone who's working agriculture. I eat meat, so I'm part of the issue here. But everyone who's worked in farm country, does anyone know what this is? It's right next to the farm. It's on the farm property.
Urine.
What's that? Yeah, this is basically a fecal pond, right? So you have to put all the materials someplace. These animals have diarrhea, right? They have loose stools. And this is a big old fecal pond somewhere on the property. And so it's just full of teeming with bacteria and antibiotics because, some of this stuff gets excreted, unmetabolized, some of it's some sort of metabolic form, and it gets out there. And it's just sitting there, right? And then these things dry on the top, and then wind blows, and it gets all over the place. And this is all over the place, right? These occur everywhere. Every place is an industrialized agricultural setting. And this is true everywhere. So you just look at, animals here in work being done by the team at WSU, some really cool stuff. They're looking at antibiotic utilization among the cattle owned by the Maasai people. in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania, they use antibiotics all the time in their animals, right? That's their livelihood. It's a central part of their culture. And so, you know, it's not uncommon to have drug-resistant bacteria in cattle here in these settings. Again, using water, defecating here, and people using the same water. And we've been able to show they've been able to show the movement of drug resistance from cattle in these settings to the Maasai people. This has also been shown in other places, like the largest slum in Africa is called Kibera in Nairobi. You know, drug resistance in the uncontained sewer water in the slums, and drug resistance occurring in the people living there. So this transmission is a big issue, again, coming full circle to some of these more impoverished areas. I know I'm getting to the end. I'm going to leave you with just one last slide, and that's on language and concepts. So I just want to leave you with this to think about. I'll just go quickly. And that's a new way to think about infectious diseases. So we just talked about a bunch of outbreaks, we talked about drug resistance. When we think about, I think this actually fits into the sort of way I think about drug resistance now, is that we have to start thinking about our bodies as having an indigenous microorganism, an indigenous microbiota, right? It's us and them all working together. They are us. And our healthy bacteria provide us with colonization resistance. I know this feels like it's sort of set in the language of sort of colonization and sort of Western stuff, but I think it's colonization resistance. So that healthy microbiota keeps us safe from infectious diseases. And we develop a homeostasis where we have a stable immune response to that indigenous microbiota that keeps us happy and healthy. An infection really is a disruption of that homeostasis that results in lower colonization resistance. So our healthy bacteria, for whatever reason, get disrupted in a way that allows exogenous bacteria or colonizing bacteria to come in and create a disease. So again, this is sort of an evolving concept in thinking about how our microbiota keep us healthy, but also are playing a role in the emergence of serious drug resistance in humans, human health, obviously in the overlap with animals. So that's it, 7:58. Yeah, oh, look, you have another word of the day, same word of the day. So I'm happy to take any questions or any comments.
You put a lot of emphasis on replacing bacterial flora after you've treated people with antibiotics. Do you use it?
Yeah. So the data on it's not overwhelming. So what we started doing at Harborview is in our trauma surgical ICU population, we started giving them all kefir every day. It has a really high CFU count.
What is that?
It's like do you guys know what kefir is? It's like a Russian yogurt. I think people buy it all the time.
What type of it is? I've always wondered what it is.
It has, I'm trying to remember the exact ones, like it's,
7 to 9.
what's that?
Yeah, there's like 7 to 9 different.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of different ones.
Mixture of.
Yeah.
But it's non-dairy based, right?
It's dairy. It's
dairy.
dairy based, but there's no lactose
How do you spell it?
because of the
The fermentation, yeah.
fermentation. Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, Kefir. So kefir, I think a lot of people say, but I was corrected. It evidently is a Russian origin, and in Russian it's pronounced kefir. I was corrected on this, so I try to be good about it. So kefir. And so it's a Russian-based yogurt and very popular. So we've been giving it to everyone. I think there's some data that seems like it's supportive. You know, a lot of my patients in the trauma surgery guys who need antibiotics, and so we're trying to keep it, you know, some of the microbiota intact. To be clear, the stuff that's in kefir and some of these other products and probiotics are poor, substitutes for what's truly in our gut. You know, each of us is sort of fingerprinted by our gut microflora, and we can't recapitulate that with a drink or a pill. So it's some help, we hope. What's really fascinating is, and I didn't talk about it today, maybe next time, is that antibiotics not only create selection pressure, but they also impact our bile acid and our pH in our gut. And that bile acid composition is also probably important and linked to our So when we kill off our good bacteria, that changes our bile acid metabolism, because they have a big role in that. And that bile acid metabolism probably changes the threshold for that colonization resistance or infection resistance, that I talk about here. So that infection resistance, that homeostatic situation, which is why C. diff is actually a big deal. And people are starting to look at bile acid administration as a way to prevent C. difficile, because we know when we give antibiotics, we're disrupting the bile acid metabolism. And so I think it's an area we don't know a ton about. The data for probiotics all by itself is okay. The Cochrane Review has a review on this, and it looks like it's on the good side. The issue is that there's also a lot of stuff of people talking about prebiotics. So there's things that are better for bacterial metabolism that people are starting to combine in what are called symbiotics. But again, it's very broad strokes without a lot of data. If I get an antibiotic, I'm taking kefir. Data is not good, but the downsides are essentially minimal. Unless you've got like a new liver transplant or a big central line. There's some associations with central lines and chemotherapy with some of the things, but and outbreak infections.
You know, every example you gave us today is really the impact of human behavior, usually maladapted human behavior.
Yes, you're getting the message. Yeah.
And I'm just curious, I don't know much about infectious disease, but I think like the biggest success the whole profession ever had was at the turn of the century with tuberculosis eradication, although it really never got eradicated just by changing how humans live.
Right.
And now all of this is the opposite of that.
Yes.
Yes.
So the most important things I think in human health that touch on infectious diseases is hygiene, vaccination, and antimicrobials, right? And hygiene is probably the most important thing, right? So getting people not to live in, packed together like cows, we're now having the same problems, right, as we did. So, giving people access to clean water, clean food, and clean living environment prevents most infectious diseases, right? We wouldn't have as much problem with influenza if people didn't come to work or go to school with influenza all the time, right? Vaccination plays an enormous role, but presenteeism also plays an enormous role, particularly in hospitals. I have outbreaks at Harborview every year that are linked to healthcare workers coming to work sick.